Yeah, so my name's Ed Smith, and today I'll be talking to you about the state of the world's coral reefs and the current threats that they're under. To start with, I thought I'd give a quick sort of introduction about myself. I'm a fourth-year PhD student here, and generally when I tell people I study corals, they kind of get this image of me strolling around in flip-flops, going around diving on reefs and snorkeling, but actually that's quite a sort of a small part of what I do. I spend a lot of my time stuck away in the lab or in front of a computer screen. But we're quite lucky here that at the university we have our own coral reef aquarium where we can grow and propagate our own corals for our experiments. And what I actually look at in my PhD is a particular type of pigment that these corals have, and how this pigment affects the ways that corals use light. And hopefully later in this talk I'll try and tie in some of the sort of bigger picture things that I've been talking about today into my project. So to give you a very kind of brief overview of what I'll be talking about today, first of all I'll just give an introduction into what is a coral and where are coral reefs, why are they important, and then really move on to the state of the world's coral reefs, the decline that we're seeing. And I'll be focusing mainly on sort of two of the main kind of threats. Oh, is that better? Okay. So yeah, I'll be looking at two of the major threats to the world's coral reefs. And I'm very much a coral biologist, so I'll be coming from that kind of standpoint, but we do have to introduce some kind of climate aspects to this. Sorry. So first of all, I thought it's a good place to start, to get everyone sort of on the same page, is to really ask the question, what is a coral? And I'm not sure if you've ever played the game 20 Questions before, but normally the first question that you ask is it an animal, a mineral, or a vegetable? So I thought I'd ask you today, and in front of you you should have these little, what we call zappers. And at the moment the polling is open, so if you can press the number according to your decision. So if you press 1, if you think a coral is an animal, you can press number 2 if you think a coral is a mineral, and lastly number 3 if you think a coral is a vegetable. So we can see that the responses are coming in. I'll give you a few more seconds, and then we'll have a look at the results and see what you guys think. Okay. Slowly trickling in. Okay, I'm going to say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see what you guys thought. Well, we have a rather bright audience here today. Yeah, a coral is an animal, but as we shall see, so you can think of these tiny little polyps, these coral polyps, you can think of them almost a bit like the sort of sea anemones that you see. They live in a colony here, and this colony secretes a calcium carbonate skeleton, which is kind of the mineral aspect of it, and this calcium carbonate skeleton that they secrete is really responsible for these big three-dimensional reefs that we can see as far away as space. So they do have kind of a mineral aspect to them. And lastly, there's also a kind of a vegetable aspect to them, because corals actually live in a symbiosis with tiny algae which live within their tissues. And this symbiosis, this relationship between the coral and the tiny plants that live within their tissues is very important to the coral. So the tiny little algae that live in the tissue, they photosynthesize, and they transfer the energy across to the coral host. And this sort of transfer of energy can supply up to sort of 95% of the coral's energy requirements, which is really quite a sort of a substantial amount, and the coral is very dependent on this. And so the coral spends a lot of energy actually accommodating these symbionts, trying to make sure that the environment that it produces is very good for these plants. And so you see these tree-like structures of the coral trying to access the light so that the symbionts can photosynthesize, because the coral is getting something from this relationship. And it's not a completely one-sided relationship, because the coral itself provides the symbionts with a place to live and also provides it with nutrients. So it's a sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. So why are coral reefs important? Well, I like to think the coral reefs are important for sort of 3 main reasons. Firstly, they're ecologically important. Secondly, they're economically important, and lastly, they're also socially very important. So in terms of sort of the ecological importance, I think you can even see from this image here that we have a wide kind of diversity of different corals in this image, different species of fish we have here, and if you were to sort of take a closer look at the little nooks and crannies, you'd see a wide variety of different invertebrates as well, and many more species that we can't even see with the naked eye. And just to kind of put that into sort of context, coral reefs cover less than 1% of the Earth's surface, but are actually home to a quarter of all marine species. And as such, they've been given the name of the rainforests of the seas. They're also socially very important. 500 million people live and are dependent on coral reefs for the services and goods that they provide. So if you think about the food supplies from fisheries, or these big reef structures that we see actually provide protection, particularly for low-lying coastal areas from storm and wave damage. So you have these barrier reefs which surround these coastal areas, so when the waves come in, the waves are dissipated by these barrier reefs. And there's many other things. So for example, the pigments I told you that I study for my PhD, well actually they're very widely used in biomedical science, and they've really revolutionized certain aspects of it. And as such, a few years ago they received a Nobel Prize, the people who are actually working in developing these pigments that we find in corals and other sort of related taxa. So they have this wide kind of a range of services and goods that they provide us, and this was also economically quite important for us. And so the next kind of question on my talk is, how much are coral reefs worth? So we have 4 options here. We have number 1, they're worth $3.65 million a year, 2, $365 million a year, 3, $3.65 billion, and 4, $365 billion. So this is for all the goods, so in terms of the fisheries, you think about things like tourism and also the storm protection. How much would it cost us to replace these coral reefs if they were to disappear? And if you can start voting, I think we've got a lot of votes already in. We'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll close the voting. Okay, I think we're more or less there now. So let's have a look at what you guys think. And again, you guys are pretty close. So the actual answer is $365 billion a year, which is really quite a phenomenal amount. But even if it was that estimation is slightly off, it's still really a remarkable amount, and it really underlies the importance of the world's coral reefs. The problem is that the coral reefs at the moment are currently in decline. So in 2008, it was estimated that about 20% of the world's coral reefs have already been lost. And within the next sort of 10 to 20 years, sort of a further 15% are threatened. And sort of looking at the projections longer term, again, it's generally a sort of a doom and gloom story. And sort of a recent study a few years ago looking at various corals around the Great Barrier Reef, much like you see in trees, corals also have growth rings, and you can look at the sort of width of these growth bands to see how much the coral's growing each year. And what they found was since sort of 1990, the actual rate of this coral growth and calcification has declined dramatically. And there are various reasons for this, and the real thing about coral reefs is that they're really under threat from a multitude of different stresses. So today I'll mainly be focusing on kind of the warming oceans and a sort of a process called ocean acidification. But the one thing I'd really like to stress is that it's not just these two, there's a lot of other threats, particularly sort of direct human impacts on coral reefs. And hopefully I'll give you an insight into a few of these during the talk. So firstly, to start with, you've heard about global warming, and not only does the kind of air temperature increase, but also the temperature of the seas also increases. So this is just some different models looking at the past sea surface temperatures over the last sort of 150 years or so. And we can see that there's some ups and downs and bumps, but the general trend is that the temperatures are increasing. And not only that, that the models have also predicted that in the future the temperatures will keep increasing if we keep increasing our output of CO2. So why is this important for corals? Well, corals are actually quite temperature sensitive in general. They can deal with the sort of normal changes through the seasons, so you get sort of temperatures going up and down from summer to winter, and generally they can cope with these. It's more the extreme temperatures that really starts to cause problems for a coral. And the actual effects of temperature impact both the coral host itself, but also these tiny little algae which live within the coral's tissues. And these have been sort of the aspect of the coral system which has been studied most in terms of its response to temperature. So when the temperature increases, what we actually see is that these symbionts, these tiny little plants which live inside the tissue, they're affected because their efficiency of photosynthesis decreases. So an amount of light which under normal conditions wouldn't normally be stressful suddenly starts to become stressful for these algae. And they produce what we call reactive oxygen species, which are essentially kind of nasty forms of oxygen, which not only can damage these algae themselves, but because these algae live within the coral tissue, they can actually damage the coral itself. And this leads to a breakdown in the relationship, and this is what we call coral bleaching. So the corals that are normally kind of this brown sort of pigmented colour, actually they lose these algae within their tissues, they're expelled or they break down. And all you can see here is the coral tissue is still here, but because there's no algae living in the tissues, you see the skeleton of the coral underneath. And when a coral is in this state, a coral is very vulnerable because, as I said earlier, the coral is very reliant on this energy supply from the algae. So you lose this relationship and the coral is very vulnerable. Corals can recover from bleaching, and they have done in the past. The problem is that they need time to recover, and they also need kind of an environment where they're not put under any further stresses. So here's just an example of a reef from Tahiti, and this is sort of data over the last sort of 20 years between 1980 and 2000. And this is just the sea surface temperature. And as I said earlier, you have these kind of undulations in the sea surface temperature corresponding to the summer and winter temperatures. But looking at kind of long-term trends of corals, certain scientists have said, well, what we seem to be seeing is that when the temperature, so the maximum summer temperature exceeds a certain threshold, this is when we start to see this bleaching, these kind of mass coral bleaching events. So how they calculate this threshold is it's about 1 degree above the annual maximum at the average of those, and so it's the average of the maximum summer temperature. So 1 degree above that is when corals bleach. So you can see here, these large arrows here indicate a bleaching event. So when the temperatures during the summer exceed these, this is when we start to see bleaching. And the extent of the bleaching that we see really depends on not only how much it goes above this temperature, but also for how long. Now, if you consider that the sea surface or the temperature is predicted to increase, and even conservative estimates, you're looking at about 1 degree within the next century, and that's a kind of a very conservative estimate. You consider these summer maximum temperatures will suddenly be pushed above this threshold. And so where these coral reefs are bleaching 5 times over a 20-year period, they could be bleaching almost annually. So whether corals can actually recover from this or adapt to it, particularly the rate at which this is occurring, at the moment we don't seem to think so, but hopefully what we'll see is that there might be some chances for corals, but I'll discuss that in a few slides. The problem is like I said, corals need time to recover, and they need to almost be left unaffected. But the problem is that we're having very direct impacts on coral reefs, and a lot of these sort of other stressors that we're seeing not only affect corals when they're healthy, but are particularly bad when corals are trying to recover because they're very vulnerable. So a good example of this, and it seems kind of indirect to start with, is actually overfishing. So if you imagine that you take all the herbivores from the reef away, then these herbivores are actually what's keeping kind of the algal growth on the reef in check. So if you imagine you don't mow your lawn, imagine these herbivores are your lawnmowers of the sea, then suddenly the grass takes over very quickly. And this is what seems to happen in coral reefs, particularly when we have these damaged reefs, is that without the presence of these herbivores due to overfishing, the algae can take hold very quickly. And it's been shown that it's very difficult for a coral reef to come back from an algal-dominated state because there's no places for the new kind of corals to settle, and the corals that are already there are very quickly becoming overgrown. Another example is pollution. So not only just sort of things like litter, but if we consider things like nutrient inputs into the water, we can see that nutrients have a very big effect on coral reefs and can certainly increase their susceptibility to bleaching, but also affect their recovery as well. We also have a lot of coastal development going on at the moment, so you can think about certain areas like the Middle East, but really it's a worldwide phenomenon that people are living by the coasts. And with all these developments, we get things like increased sedimentation into the reefs, and corals can literally be smothered by this increase in sediment. But also with these developments, you also go back to the whole pollution idea as well. We also have divers and tourism, and if the divers are responsible, then that's great. But if you imagine a site of a reef where there's 2 dive trips there a day, and just all you need is one irresponsible person on each dive who accidentally breaks off a bit of a coral, and you have that twice a day for, let's say, 320 days a year, then you can start to see where the problems start arising. So on a healthy reef, it's not great and it's not good, but particularly on a damaged reef where the corals are struggling, this really kind of exacerbates the problem. And then lastly, we also have diseases as well. Much like you and me, if you imagine when you're very tired and you're stressed, you're very susceptible to getting a cold. And the same thing happens with corals, is that when they're stressed and they're weak, they're also very vulnerable to other sort of pathogens. And so there's an increase in kind of coral disease as well occurring. So the question you're probably asking is actually, is there any hope, particularly with the kind of the projections? Well, there is some hope, because the thing about this bleaching is that we get these kind of mass bleaching events, but not every coral behaves in the same way. Certainly in certain regions, but also certain species behave differently. So you can find areas of reef where some corals may have bleached and others haven't. And scientists are really now trying to understand why this is happening. And it seems, again, a lot of the focus has been on the actual algae that live in the tissues, and that's what I'll focus on today. But the actual coral itself may also play a role in this. So these algae which live within the tissues were originally thought to be one species, but now they seem to be a very diverse group. And you don't really need to know too much about this tree diagram here, but the only kind of key bit to take away from this is that we have these kind of different groups of symbionts, and within these groups we have different sort of subgroups. And within this we have a lot of physiological diversity. So it's not just a kind of molecular diversity. There are different groups which have different sort of physiological tolerances. So, for example, this D group may be more thermally tolerant than another group. And so there may be promise that some corals with the sort of D-type symbionts may be more resistant to these thermal events than others. So to try and kind of explain almost the challenges with that, I tried to think of a way of kind of describing this. And so I put it into this idea that there's a relationship between the coral and its symbionts. So if you imagine here, this is the coral, and it has to decide which symbiont it wants. Well, most people would say, well, if we're having these bleaching events occurring and things like that, why doesn't all corals, why don't they all have the thermally tolerant ones? What's the point of having the other options? So I kind of put this into the context of a relationship and me trying to find the one. So there are various kind of ladies here, and I have to pick which one that I want. But it's not as simple as that, as we all know. It's not a case of me just picking what I want and getting what I want. So first of all, we have what we call host symbiont specificity. So the corals and the algae have tastes, as it were. There are certain corals which can't go with certain symbionts. So although there may be a sort of a thermally tolerant symbiont which would be good for that coral, if that's not possible, if there's not that kind of relationship between the two, then it can't occur. So that's one thing we have to think about. The next thing is symbiont availability as well. Now, in this example, probably all of these ladies aren't available to me. But just for the argument's sake, let's just say that Carol Vorderman's not available to me. Again, it narrows down my choices. But to kind of bring this back into sort of the coral context, is that scientists have thought, well, if availability is the only thing that's really limiting these corals from having these thermally tolerant symbionts, well, maybe we can actually grow these algae in culture and then start almost seeding the reefs with this type of algae in the hope that the coral will take these algae and then become more thermally tolerant. But again, there's still issues with this, and this is something which is still kind of greatly discussed, and I'll continue this relationship analogy with two very hypothetical relationships. So here I've put myself with two different ladies, and for the purposes of kind of legal reasons, this is not a reflection on either lady's character. It's just purely for an example of a hypothetical relationship. So if you imagine my relationship with Lady A, and let's say when the times are good, everything's great, we're going out partying till 5 in the morning and I'm having a great time and everything's brilliant. So in the terms of the coral, if it's with this kind of symbiont, during the good times, the coral's growing really fast, it's calcifying well, it's building these reefs. But when we have a stressful event, the relationship breaks down. The relationship's very fragile in that respect. Whereas in the other relationship, the good times might not be quite so good. So what we seem to be seeing with these thermally tolerant strains is that these corals don't seem to be growing quite as well as the ones. And that may be the reason why we have these other type of symbionts, because they allow the corals to grow very fast and very opportunistic. Whereas these thermally tolerant ones, you can understand that maybe they have to put a bit more energy into the relationship, so in improving their defenses against the thermal stress in order to have a successful relationship. So it may not be a simple case of just seeding these reefs, but it's certainly still an option that we need to consider. So here I move on now to the other kind of major threat to the world's coral reefs, and that's ocean acidification. And you may have sort of seen it sort of pop up in the press recently in the last sort of few years. And I've just picked out some very kind of random examples here, but if you have a look on the internet, I'm sure you'll find many more. But increasingly acidic oceans leave coral reefs on the brink of extinction. Or we have acid oceans turn Finding Nemo fish deaf. And just to kind of show you that it's not just coral reefs that are under threat from this ocean acidification, but also here we have Arctic seas turn to acid, putting vital food chain at risk. So I thought a good place to start here was with a question. So the kind of question that I'm going to ask you is that currently the seawater pH is between about pH 8 to pH 8.2. And I've put a rough kind of pH scale up here with a couple of examples to kind of give you an idea of what these different pHs sort of relate to. So pH 7 here we have is neutral, and that sort of relates to pure water. pH 5 is sort of equivalent to black coffee. pH 2, lemon juice. pH 0, battery acid. So the kind of question I'm asking you is, whereabouts do you think seawater is moving to under this ocean acidification? So if you think it's going between, say, seawater and pure water, so between pH 8 and pH 7, then press option 1. If you think it's going between pH 7 and pH 5, press option 2. So this was in sort of the next 100 years, let's say. If you think it's between pH 5 and pH 2, then option 3. And lastly, pH 0 and pH 2, then pick option 4. So we'll give you guys a few more seconds. I think we're almost there. So this is the answer I'm quite actually interested in really seeing what you guys think. So, again, you continue to impress me. So the actual correct answer is pH between pH 7 and pH 8. But this whole term of kind of the whole idea of this ocean acidification sometimes can be a bit confusing, because by having the word acid in the acidification, it automatically makes people think that, like the previous headline suggested, the seas are turning to acid. Now, the reason why they say acidification is simply just a movement from a pH here towards the acids, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's acidic. Because some people argue, well, you could say it's ocean neutralization, so moving towards the middle. But that could be a movement in either direction depending on where your starting pH is. So that's why they use the term acidification. So again, you think that, well, it's moving between pH 7 and pH 8. Is that really important? What kind of effects can this have? But actually, these very, very minor changes in pH, and we're talking on a scale of sort of 0.1 pH units, can really have quite a large effect. Now, I'm fully aware most people, including myself, are not big fans of equations, so I won't go into the full ins and outs of these equations, but I'll just try and give you the important points here. And that's really that as the CO2 in the atmosphere increases, some of that CO2 is drawn into the oceans. And when it's drawn into the ocean, it reacts with the water to produce these hydrogen ions. And these hydrogen ions are what's really responsible for this acidification. It lowers the pH. But the key point to sort of take home here is just that these hydrogen ions, which are being formed by CO2 coming into the oceans, actually react with the carbonate ions in the seawater. And by moving them to another form, these bicarbonate ions, they actually remove carbonate ions from the system. So the kind of real key message here is that carbonate ion concentration decreases as you increase CO2 concentration. And there's just a small chart here. So as CO2 concentration increases, so this is CO2 in the atmosphere, parts per million, as that increases, the amount of carbonate ions decreases. Why is that important for corals? Well, corals need carbonate ions to build this calcium carbonate skeleton. So these big reef structures, which are responsible for a lot of the diversity that we see within coral reefs, are responsible for protecting coral reefs from wave damage, provide all these kind of ecological niches for all these different species. They're in these increasingly, or under this ocean acidification, corals are losing their ability to build these reefs. So less carbonate ions, reduced calcification rate, reduced capacity to build these reefs. And if we kind of look at the kind of CO2 situation that we're predicted to see in the future, again, it really kind of starts to raise an alarm. So here, the black dashed line here shows the CO2 change that's been measured over the last sort of 50 years. And we can see that it has increased, and at the moment it's increasing at about 2 parts per million per year. And then the IPCC have predicted sort of various different scenarios and tried to model how this increase in CO2 will change over time. Now, the kind of key thing to really sort of take home here is that this B1 scenario in most cases seems to be kind of the best bet that they think we have. And even then, we're over 500 parts per million by the end of the century. And if we put that into the context of the last sort of 600,000 years, so here we have our data points just up here. So this red line just up here is the change that we've seen recently. If we look over the last 600,000 years, we haven't quite seen anything that high before. And you look at these predictions here, and we can see that even the lowest estimate is substantially higher than what we've seen for the last 600,000 years. So these parts per million values, how do they kind of relate to the corals, and what's safe for a coral? What's a good atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide for a coral? Well, there was a paper in 2007 which showed these plots, and I'll just quickly guide you through them. So first of all, we have these pink dots on here represent where coral reefs are currently found. So you can see here that we have the Great Barrier Reef, and we have the different reef regions of the world. But the kind of important thing to take here is that we have these coloured contour lines, and the colour shows us this aragonite saturation state. And again, I kind of won't go too much into the details of how this is calculated, but the real kind of key point to sort of take home here is that anything, an aragonite saturation state above 3.3 is an environment where coral reefs can continue to grow and be maintained. Under 3.3, so anything that's not in blue on this, this image, is where corals can't maintain the coral reefs as we know them today. And so if you look at, this is, says today's, and this is the, in 2007, this was the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's currently actually, it's now 394 parts per million. But you can generally see that all of the coral reefs around the world are all found within these blue zones, so where coral reefs can grow and be maintained. However, when we start to look to the future, based on these different emission scenarios, we can actually see that the area in which we can find these coral reefs, or where the conditions are available for coral reefs to grow and to calcify, very much declines. So this is at 380 parts per million. If we increase to 450, you could already see that a lot of this blue region's decreasing. And again, as we increase, we start losing more and more of these regions. By the time we get to 650, there's pretty much nowhere left for the corals to grow and calcify and form these reefs that we're expecting. So if I just show you this animation again and sort of remind you that even under kind of the best case scenario, we were looking at somewhere in the region of 450 to 500 parts per million. Even then, we're not in a great situation for coral reefs, because even at 450, you see there's a dramatic decline in the area available for the coral reefs in order to build these reefs and really function as we know them today. So in this paper, again, had these kind of images. It had some various numbers and whatever. I thought these images are actually quite a nice way of showing potentially what the reefs of the future could look like under these different scenarios. So under kind of a 375 ppm, so under a really kind of healthy, almost better than now situation, we have these nice healthy coral reefs with this nice structural complexity, which provides sort of a home for the fish and the various species, but is also very good for us because we have these reefs which are functioning and providing us with these resources. When we start to get to 450 to 500 parts per million and the kind of 2-degree rise which this could potentially bring in sea surface temperature, we start to lose reefs as we know them, particularly in certain regions of the world which are on the higher latitudes. And then as we increase again above 500 parts per million, we really start to lose the reefs which we know as we know them. And this was a paper, and this was just kind of a visual representation from a paper in 2007. And in a few years ago in 2011, there was another paper which found a kind of almost like a natural laboratory for CO2 experiments, because there's a volcano which is seeping CO2 into the water. And so it made a very good case study to see how CO2 affects a coral reef. And what they found really is we have the volcanoes here, and this is where most of the CO2 is being seeped. So you can see as we move away from this area, we get sort of more normal conditions. And under the kind of normal conditions, you see the reef as you'd expect, nice and diverse, lots of different species of coral, and everything's looking really healthy. As we start to move closer, so as the CO2 concentration increases, we start to lose this complexity of the coral. It becomes a lot more uniform, so there's a lot more of the same species found rather than diversity. And again, when we get to the really high concentrations of CO2, we really lose the reef, particularly as we know it. There are still corals here, and again, this is this kind of idea of having winners and losers. Not every coral will probably be wiped out, but the coral reefs that we know and we rely on look like they're going to be lost under these really kind of high emission or even sort of medium emission scenarios. So to kind of summarize the sort of key points there is that corals are really important ecosystems, economically, socially and ecologically. They're under threat, and they're under threat from a multitude of different stresses, not only the kind of the two that I've really gone into depth with today, but also a variety of others, particularly ones that we could actually change. So things like the nutrient runoffs is something that we can control and do better. Again, this sort of idea that there may be winners and losers under these different scenarios. So there may be more thermally tolerant symbionts or thermally tolerant corals which could survive, but the kind of reefs that we know them, these diverse habitats, will be lost if things don't change. And this really will have sort of an impact on society, whether you look at it from the potential effects of the mass migration of people moving away from these regions where once there was enough there to support their livings and their livelihoods, or even just subsistence. There once was enough food to support these populations. They're going to have to go somewhere. The economics as well, if you're trying to replace 365 billion to the world economy every year, again, it's a big question as to how you're going to do this. And then lastly, just to kind of bring this back to what I do, in the sense that when I generally say to people, I study these pigments in corals and it doesn't quite link into this kind of bigger picture stuff. Well, these various kind of pigments that we see in corals, and they have a very kind of particular structure which I won't go into, but they're a very interesting molecule. As I said, they're very widely studied in sort of biomedical science. However, actually understanding their function in the corals, very little is known about it. But one thing they might be doing is almost protecting the algal symbionts, so these little plants that live inside the tissue. They might be protecting them from too much light, so from light stress. So as I said, when we have these kind of warmer oceans, the coral becomes more sensitive to light, so a light intensity that once the coral could deal with quite happily suddenly starts to become stressful. Well, potentially these pigments may be able to protect in these cases. But again, it's something that really kind of requires further study, which is hopefully something I'm adding to. But they also have a very kind of unique benefit to these pigments as well, is that a lot of these pigments are fluorescent. So it means we can shine a light of one colour onto them and they turn that light into another colour, which makes it very easy for us to use them in monitoring. So at the moment, they're very widely used in kind of cell biology to sort of light up parts of cells. So people are using them to track kind of cancer cells to see how tumours grow and things like that. But we may be able to now take this technology back to the reef to be able to use this to monitor coral reefs, particularly because these pigments seem to be sensitive to a lot of the environmental variables that corals are sensitive to. Things like at temperature, we do see a very big decline in the concentrations of these pigments. And so if we could find a way of monitoring these over the long term, we may get sort of early indications of when corals are stressed, and then be able to sort of direct management efforts to try and help protect these reefs which are in danger. And to really kind of, to sort of show you how widespread they are on the reef, I've just got a very kind of quick video. It's only sort of 20 seconds, but it's just where we've gone to a reef in Israel, in Eilat, and we're actually looking at this fluorescence in the shallow water corals. Oh, there we go. So here we are just with a normal underwater camera, but set up for this fluorescence imaging, and you can see that a lot of these corals in the shallow water all have these fluorescent pigments, and it's about 97% of shallow water corals have these pigments, and we can see that if we look carefully, there's different coloured pigments which do have certain differences in their behaviour, but it's very widespread and it's something very easy to measure, and it's because of the nature of fluorescence, it's very sensitive as well. So it could really help us improve the monitoring of coral reefs in the future. And another one of the main sort of benefits is that you're not picking up anything else which is around. So as a snorkeler, snorkeling in the dark and not being able to see anything but the glowing corals can be a little unnerving, because you won't be able to see a fluorescent shark because there aren't any. But the fact is that it's very, very handy for imaging, because you don't have to worry about trying to remove any kind of noise or anything else like that. You just see the corals that are there. And if you're interested in seeing a little bit more of that fluorescence, as part of National Science Week, there's Ocean and Earth Day down at the National Oceanography Centre on Saturday, where some of my colleagues will be doing a fluorescence display, so you can actually have a look at some of the corals in our lab and look at their fluorescence. And if you want some more details, you can either go to the National Oceanography Centre website or our Facebook page. I'd like to thank my various sponsors for my PhD and ask if there are any questions. Thank you.